Friends, welcome to the colloquium series talk of the afternoon by Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed. It gives me the greatest pleasure to welcome Professor Ahmed. I'm just waiting for him to finish that conversation. I see. I could say that I can welcome you in several languages that you and I can, of course, and we can welcome you in several languages that you and I understand, and we are very touched that you are here. I shall stick to English very largely, except to say that आपका इस्तकबाल तो हम करते ही हैं और जी आया नू, but I shall stick to English, not switch over to Punjabi and Urdu because of our audience. Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed is a Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Stockholm University in Sweden. He's also Honorary Senior Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. He has been coming to India quite a lot, and this time he's here on the invitation of none other than Mahatma Gandhi's grandson, Raj Mohan Gandhi. He's been a great friend of India, and he's written several articles in the Daily Times of Lahore about the Indo-Pak relationship, and I was talking to him informally about it, and maybe you will have the time to interact with him after his talk, and you could also speak to him about that issue and that subject. Professor Ahmed has, in the last few years, published a book on the partition of India, which is called The Punjab Bloodied, Partitioned and Cleansed, Unraveling the 1947 Tragedy Through Secret British Reports and First-Person Accounts. And he's also done a book called Pakistan, the Garrison State, Origins, Evolution, Consequences, 1947 to 2011. So today, he will speak to us about the Pakistan military in politics, predicament of a garrison state. And I'm sure this will be a kind of a biography of the Pakistani army and how it became the most powerful institution in Pakistan. And I'm sure that as we hear him, we'll also understand some of the impediments that he thinks have come in the way of Pakistan developing some significant economic and political institutions. I suppose, as you've done in your several articles, you'll probably relate this to the degree of robustness of civil society in Pakistan, to the notion of territorial nationalism, stroke religious nationalism, and as you and I agree, one of the very interesting distinctions in any analysis of nationalism is the one between civic nationalism on the one side and cultural or ethnic nationalism on the other, and I do hope that some of your analysis will also connect with that distinction. In Pakistan, as you know, ever since its creation in 1947, there's been a huge debate within the country about whether we are a Muslim country, namely a country for South Asia's Muslims, a national state for the Muslims of South Asia, or whether we should be and are a theocratic Islamic state. So I'm sure many of these issues will come into play as Professor Ahmed talks, and I welcome him very warmly to this southern city. I suppose this is your first visit to Bangalore, and I do hope that you'll come to Bangalore again. Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed.
Chechi, Professor Gowda, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I am greatly honored by Azim Premji University to be invited to discuss my latest book, which touches a topic on which the whole world wants some clues as to what went wrong with the Pakistani state project. So this book has been published only very recently, the 15th of January. It was released by Oxford University Press, Karachi. And the Indian edition was scheduled now for the 23rd of February, which would be day after tomorrow. But somehow there was a change in the commissioning editor, and so they are delayed. So you'll have to wait for a while, but I'll try my best to present the Pakistani case like it's very simple. Two states were born more or less on the same day, India and Pakistan. One went on to be a democracy, and it's a democracy which has reproduced itself now for the last 65 years. And that is India. And I must compliment you for this great achievement. Hardly any other multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious, multilinguistic society would face such great ordeals and upheavals in becoming a coherent political system. And I think India, by and large, acquits itself very well. There is a lot to be done, and I'm sure you all are familiar where things need to be done. But in the case of Pakistan, unfortunately, the Pakistani state project ran into trouble. So before I do that, I was looking desperately for a map which I thought an Indian audience could accept as neutral enough. The peculiarity of Pakistan is that at its birth, it comprised of two separated geographical entities, and that in itself is built into the geographical, psychological nature of the Pakistani state. The puzzle that I want to solve in this 45-50 minutes is the following. The Pakistan military, which basically is the Pakistan army, was not very well equipped in 1947, and it lacked the training needed for a modern national state. But few would doubt or dispute the fact that over time it acquired virtual veto powers over the internal and external affairs of Pakistan. So how do we explain this? Now, many people have tried to unravel, to solve this puzzle, and ideas of a vice-regal system, that it was a continuation of the type of 1935 Act government with the British viceroy at the center of power being the real bearer of all powers, continuing with Pakistan and so on. Others have argued in terms of the national security state. I looked for a theoretical framework which could somehow help us go beyond what was in the field. And I then looked at the concept of a garrison state. Basically, the garrison state, as the very wording would tell you, is about a state in which the sense of insecurity is paramount, and therefore real or imagined or contrived threats to its existence define its way of prioritizing its policies. The idea of a garrison state as a political science concept is from the late 1930s, when the Japanese militarism broke on the world political scene, followed by the rise of Nazism. And an American political scientist, Harold Laswell, then started arguing that states which fear foreign aggression but are industrially advanced would end up becoming garrison states in which the experts on violence, armed men, would be dominating politics, and that they would like to extend their influence in the economic, cultural, educational sectors of society. Now, he, of course, argued that such a state would emerge in an industrially advanced society. So he had a sort of structural political economy argument about it. And obviously, Pakistan doesn't fit the bill as an industrially advanced country. Then I thought one could use Hamza Alavi's concept of a post-colonial state. Those of us who went to school and college in the 60s and 70s would be familiar with Alavi, a Pakistani veteran sociologist. He argued that in the Pakistani case, the state was more developed than society. Now, this whole notion is basically derived from classical Marxist theory, where the state is simply an agent of the ruling class. But Alavi argued that in a post-colonial state, the colonial state is more advanced than the society that it has become a part of. And of course, he said that in the case of India, this did not happen. Why? Because already a national bourgeoisie. A bourgeoisie is like the industrial class, middle class people, having a nationalist orientation, already assuming a leading role in the development of society. And therefore, the Congress party, with its mass-based support and the fact that there was a strong national bourgeoisie and about 50 years of preparation for the freedom of India, enabled India to become a neo-colonial state. A neo-colonial state is a state still somehow under the domination of the colonial imperialist powers, but still in a position to determine its internal and external affairs more or less successfully. But in a post-colonial state, argued Alavi, the advanced state is connected to the international center of imperialism. Basically, this idea was derived from what was known as the dependency theory. As you know, the dependency theory is basically a political economy way of looking at the world, in which the people at that time, many of them, Samir Amin, Wallerstein, and Andre Gundar Frank, many of them had different positions, but basically the argument was that the whole world is penetrated by international capitalism, and that was the US, and that linkage enables the center of international capitalism to draw, to suck up the surplus, the economic wealth produced in the peripheries. So the peripheries simply produced a surplus, of which a small portion was retained by the by the classes involved in this exploitation, and the rest ended up with the center. So Alavi's idea was that Pakistan was such a state, and he argued that the Pakistani state was relatively autonomous. Now, once again, this is a Marxist idea where the autonomy of the state happens at historical junctures, like in 1830 and 1840, when there were these French revolutions, after the main revolution. And for a while, the ruler then became more powerful than the classes. But Alavis argued that in the case of states like Pakistan, this was a permanent feature of the state, that the state was permanently relatively autonomous vis-a-vis the society. So this is an idea I then adopted, but I went on to argue that whereas Alavi argues in terms of a mechanical relationship between the center and the periphery, if we extend this post-colonial state, or rather contextualize it in an international political context, we notice that in international relations, this sort of mechanical relationship doesn't exist. On the contrary, in the international situation, there is anarchy of relationships. Why? Because there are asymmetries of power. Power is skewed, but it is not structured in a way that there is a chain of command at the top, which then percolates the rest of the structure. Rather, it is fluctuating all the time. And so something like a state in which you have the government and the distribution of power and the constitution, which can command obedience from the rest of society. In the international relations, the alliances are made and unmade. Many things are ad hoc. So I then sort of synthesized the two and went on to argue that a post-colonial garrison state is one in which a third world state, a developing state, fearing external aggression, real or imagined or manipulated, this is not the issue, but basically the fear of aggression, is able to exploit the anarchy in the international system and use that to its advantage to acquire military equipment and training needed to dominate society. So even if it's not an industrially advanced society where the experts on violence automatically develop, a third world state can successfully exploit the contradictions in the international system and find patrons, supporters, donors willing to give it economic aid and military aid for its security purposes. And I think this is exactly what Pakistan was able to achieve. Sorry, the three classes? Oh, I thought the three classes would be like, as I was saying, in the case of India, it would be the national bourgeoisie and a weak landlord class and the bureaucracy, in which the argument would be that the political party is the dominant factor. In the case of Pakistan, it would be the civil bureaucracy and the military, the real institutions of a national character, whereas the national bourgeoisie was absent in the case of Pakistan. And this is true. There was no national bourgeoisie worth the name when Pakistan came into being. Pakistan had the areas which were given to Pakistan lacked industrial development. There were very few modern productive units. A few textile mills, a few mills in East Pakistan working with jute, but otherwise there was very little industry. The dominant class in the case of Pakistan were the landlords. So here is a situation where there is a landlord class, and as we all know, I think even in India, landlords are never in favor of democracy. Okay? So we cancel out the landlords, but the national bourgeoisie, if it is not there, is also not in favor of democracy because it's not there to promote democracy. And the third is the state itself, which is the civil bureaucracy and the military, which, as we know, were the strongest national institutions that Pakistan inherited. So the contrast is with how India and Pakistan looked like when they were born. This just might be interesting even to an Indian audience. I'll go through very quickly because I think I have 50 minutes in which to present my arguments. It took me 2 hours to do it at the Tata Institute, and that's actually ideally needed, but we'll have to rush through some of these things. When this whole idea of Pakistan came up in the 1940s, the British initially were against it. And the reason why they thought India should remain united even if power is handed over to the Indians was that they wanted India to be a dominion still under a constitutional obligation to the British monarch. And they were hoping that in such a relationship, their prize institution, the British Indian Army, would still be at their disposal to be deployed in the world wherever they wanted. This was the British assumption. But in 1946, there was a reconsideration of this. And there was a discussion going on if Pakistan was not preferable. Why? Because it was feared that the Indian state may not toe the line of British imperialism, if you want to call it. Jawaharlal Nehru was considered too independent, and the Congress party, because of its freedom struggle, not a reliable partner. On the 14th of May 1947, finally, and I have in the book quoted it verbatim, the three heads of the British Armed Forces and the hero of the Second World War, Field Marshal Montgomery, and some people from the Indian Colonial Office prepared a memorandum in which they said that we need a Pakistan, or a Western Pakistan especially, because it will enable Britain to have bases in this region, and which will enable it to control the sea lanes in the Persian Gulf. And of course, as you know, British policy in the Indian subcontinent was fixated with the Russian advance southwards. So containment of the Soviet Union and a role in the maintenance of the control over oil, they thought would be better fulfilled by Pakistan. So it's very late that in the British assessment, the creation of Pakistan was good. Why? Because they realized that Mr. Jinnah was not willing to let the Indian Army remain one. He demanded not only a partition of India, but also of the British Indian Army. The Americans, on the other hand, who later on became the first patrons of Pakistan, were very strongly opposed to the creation of Pakistan. Neither in India nor in Pakistan this is realized, that the most consistent supporters of Indian freedom from British rule was Franklin D. Roosevelt, the American president. We can always, discuss what were the reasons for it, but one argument would be that he was a committed social liberal and believed that colonialism was an anachronistic hangover and it's time to finish all that and people should have the freedom. So when Pakistan came into being, the Americans only at the very last moment sent a formal letter of congratulations and wishing Pakistan well. All other evidence is that they were opposed to the creation of Pakistan. Even Jinnah was portrayed as a divisive factor, power hungry, and so on and so forth. The third power which is interesting was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union at that time was dominated by a left line, which is like Stalin and his comrades believed that Mahatma Gandhi and his idea of a peaceful resistance and so on would not fit into the idea of a world revolution. Whereas Pakistan, with its sort of Islamic socialism and so on, might not be a bad idea. Although they were conscious of the fact that Pakistan could also become an outpost of the international system. So these were the three main forces at that time. Now, the reason I showed you the map was that if you look at it, anybody who comes to power in Pakistan must somehow ensure that the two wings of the state can withstand any real aggression from India. As we all know, India and Pakistan didn't part company on the best of relations. On the contrary, The whole partition of India was bloody. The process of transfer of power was disputed. It was disputes over territory. It was dispute over how to share the common assets of the colonial administration. And Pakistan kept on blaming India for not having enough goodwill to give it even the formal share of 36 in a proportion of 64 to India, saying that some of the tanks which were sent were useless and some of the guns which were sent were also not workable and so on. The Kashmir dispute, I don't think I want to spend time on it, except to acknowledge here in an Indian audience, because it's in the book. Pakistan bungled up its case on Kashmir because it's all well known that the Maharaja wanted to remain independent. And which is not to say that India did not pressure the Maharaja to accede to India even when he wanted to be independent. And similarly, Pakistan wanted Kashmir to be a part of Pakistan simply because it had 80%, 74% majority of Muslims, saying that the logic of partition was Muslim majority areas going to Pakistan, although this was a princely state and it was complicated and so on. Anyhow, on the night of the 21st, 22nd, 23rd October, Pakistan dispatched tribesmen and regulars dressed up as mujahideen and so on into India, Kashmir. And at that time, the Maharaja then asked for help from India, and India made it conditional that you sign the accession bill, and then we will come to your rescue. Although in the accession bill it was said that this is temporary and the actual terms of accession will be discussed later, can be worked out later. Anyhow, on the 27th of October, Indian armed forces were parachuted into the valley, and then there was a war and so on. Finally, the Pakistan army itself went in its regular uniforms. I think it was in April or February 1948. And for a while they were fighting. Yes, February 1948. For 2 months, the regular armies were fighting until they both agreed to a ceasefire. And the ceasefire then left 2/3 roughly of Kashmir with India and 1/3 with Pakistan. That was the ceasefire line, which, as you all know, became the line of control after the Shimla Agreement in 1972. But why I think this is important in the book is because I have argued that this was the first case where an argument developed in Pakistan that whereas through jihad and military action we were advancing, the civilian government of Liaquat Ali Khan got cold feet and it agreed to a ceasefire. And had this ceasefire not been agreed, we would have captured Kashmir and it would be part of Pakistan. So there was an attempt to celebrate the Pakistan military and the fighting men's bravery and so on, and the cowardice of the civilians in contrast. But it was still not like the army using it as a pretext to capture power. Till 1951, the Americans bent over backwards to the Americans, saying, please adopt us into your anti-communist policies to contain the Soviet Union. We will do anything for you, fight for you in the Middle East, fight for you in Southeast Asia, because East Pakistan is connected to that part of the world, and of course in South Asia. But the Americans, as I said, were from day one committed, if you can call it, or in their assessment, a strong India was paramount for this region to withstand communism of all sorts. Additionally, in the American experience of Asia, the Soviet Union was not all that bad because Stalin and Roosevelt had been partners during the Second World War. On the other hand, the Americans had been supporting the Kuomintang in China. As we know, Mao Zedong defeated or was on the verge of defeating the Kuomintang. So they thought a united India was important to keep the Chinese out of South Asia. So from the American point of view, a strong India was needed for all sorts of communism, but the bugbear was China. Whereas for the British, it had been always the Soviet Union. Anyhow, in 1951, I think Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru finally made it public that he would not be joining either the US or the Soviet blocs, and he would toe some sort of neutral policy, out of which later on came the non-alignments movement, and that is when Pakistani pleas in Washington and elsewhere began to be heard by the Americans. And the first consignment of arms were sent in 1951, followed with Eisenhower, who was then elected president, and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who was a born-again Catholic or Christian or whatever, believing that the Pakistani Muslims were real fighters against communism, against atheism. So we had the first agreement in 1954, where Pakistan becomes an ally of the Americans, only to be reinforced in another agreement in 1959. So there are two military pacts that Pakistan entered with the Americans. And Pakistan started calling itself the most allied ally of the United States. This was Pakistan's pride at that time. But although in the two military pacts, in the agreements, this is not mentioned, but in subsequent supplementary documents, the Americans made it very clear that the arms given to Pakistan were not to be used in a war against India, especially a war in which Pakistan initiates the hostilities. That portion the Pakistanis pretended not to notice. And the Americans, I think, from day one realized that basically the Pakistanis needed these weapons against India. But if they get things from us, we can also extract, obedience from them. Anybody who gives you charity always has the final word. This we know in our daily lives as well. So the American, who was cleverer, you can always judge for yourself. But the Americans, I don't think, were so stupid. But by the mid-50s, they were very clear that Pakistan needed all these weapons against India, but had been given the weapons under the express understanding that they would be used in a war against the Soviet Union. So Pakistan committed the second major blunder, and that was in 1965 of sending infiltrators into Kashmir the second time, hoping that the Kashmiris would spontaneously rise up, join the Pakistanis, and Kashmir will be liberated. At that time, in the book I've gone in great length to expose this, it seems that there was a belief in the Pakistani military headquarters, including General Ayub, who was in power at that time, where I think we should go forward. I'm not going to follow the order in which these slides are. Otherwise, you give me 2 hours. So but I think this is important. Maybe I should come back to this modernistic reform. We come here and then I go back. Ayub Khan had taken power in 1958. I'll have to present that to you as well. But since we were into the military and Kashmir war, so I thought this is connected. Three characters were basic to this Kashmir project. Z.A. Bhutto, Foreign Secretary Aziz Ahmed, Bhutto was then Foreign Minister, and Brigadier Akhtar Hussain Malik, who masterminded this plan to go into Kashmir. And apparently, Bhutto was able to convince Ayub and the others that India would not dare cross the international border, whereas us sending infiltrators is all right because Kashmir is disputed territory. Actually, in the 47-48 war, so was the pattern. The war had been confined to Kashmir. It had not been across the two international borders. So partly it was that precedent, and then, Z.A. Bhutto had been to Princeton and come back as a professor of international law, and he insisted that the Indians would follow the rules in the book. And I remember I was then sleeping on the roof. At that time it was quite safe in the summers to sleep out. So it was early morning, and when the whole Lahore skies were, the peace was broken by this roaring noise of aircraft, almost going at rooftops. And these were Sabre and other aircraft going towards Wagah. And we were at war with India. What I learned later on was that the Indians came to Lahore, sent their advance forces at the early hours of the morning, when the Pakistani military were doing PT exercises. So you can well imagine that how well prepared were we, having sent our fighters into Kashmir, but believing in Mr. Bhutto's stupid idea that the Indians wouldn't cross into Pakistan because it was the international border, and so says international law. Anyhow, they bungled the whole case, and after 3 days, Pakistan was desperately short of spare parts to fly its aircraft. I'm sure India would have been in a similar situation a few days later. But so it was a desperate situation, and the Americans on the 9th of September imposed an arms embargo on both India and Pakistan. Practically it hurt Pakistan, which was dependent on the Americans, whereas India had basically relied on the British and I think also some French and German material, but not so much on the Americans. So basically the Pakistani military was paralyzed. And both went to the UN and asked for a ceasefire, and this was granted. So there was a 17 days war. But let me tell you, I was one of those who believed that Pakistan had won the war. And Ayub Khan this time had chickened out. And it was our brave soldiers who were advancing and the Indians were running away. But this was the propaganda machine churning out the stories. Poor Ayub Khan, he then had to go to Tashkent and sign the Tashkent agreement, where he got no concessions on Kashmir. So he came back with a long face, and Bhutto exploited it right when this Tashkent thing was going on by appearing theatrically to show that he was against the Tashkent agreement. And he said, we will fight 1,000 years India to liberate and so on. So Ayub Khan falls, Mr. Bhutto comes to power. So the 65 war is the second situation where the reputation of the Pakistani army is promoted in an inflated manner. That being 1/5 of India, having less aircraft, less soldiers and so on, we were not only able to stop them, they crossed Lahore, but then we stopped them at the border, but that we were advancing into India, and then Ayub Khan somehow agreed to the ceasefire. So this jingoism, the idea that the Pakistan military is the savior of Pakistan, comes from the second war. Let me very briefly go back. This is quite all right. While we were looking at the rise of the military because of the wars, we also have to understand that, as I have already laid down, the Pakistani politics from the beginning were dominated by incompetent politicians. Mr. Jinnah, who founded Pakistan, died a year later, and his successor, Liaquat Ali Khan, was assassinated on the 16th of October 1951. Once these two national stature leaders were gone, the Muslim League, which had come together to demand the partition of India, could not function as a unified, coherent party. Rather, it was a collection of regional, caucuses, power blocks, cliques, who started fighting each other as to who would rule. Would it be a Punjabi or a Bengali, and so on. And at that stage, the civil servant stepped in and took over power. And from 47 to 58, we had about 7-8 governments headed by civilians. But after Pakistan came into being, there were no elections held, general elections. So they were all elected in 1946 and therefore didn't have a popular mandate. With the result that the civilians would dismiss them, rightly so, because of the corruption which was rampant in Pakistan. Another problem which I think in my book I make a big point of is that it's not simply security and the failure of the politicians, but also the problem of identity of Pakistan. As Professor Sethi was saying, there are two ways of looking at nationalism. One is the inclusive model, where you include all citizens, all individuals born in your territory into the category of citizens and confer equal rights on them. It's called the civic model. Then in contrast, you have the cultural, ethnic model of nationalism, where the nation is based on the basis of shared culture. Actually, the idea comes from the Germanic experience, where it was through blood. You had to be German by blood in order to be part of the German nation. And that is how the German-speaking Jews were excluded and later on liquidated. Okay? Pakistan had this problem that it had been won in the name of a religious claim, saying that Pakistan would be the nation of the Muslims. But when Pakistan was founded, there were minorities on both in East and West Pakistan, less in West Pakistan, but more in East Pakistan, about 30% of the population. The second thing was that the Congress party never developed the proper mechanisms to challenge the whole notion of a Muslim nation. The assumption being that all Muslims are part of one nation was Mr. Jinnah's most successful, I think, political ploy. Because within the Muslim community, if you look at its history, there have been serious conflicts. Right when the Prophet died, the dispute started as to who would succeed him. And to this day, that dispute is still at the basis of the Shia-Sunni conflict. Then we have the Wahhabi, and then we have the Sufis, and we have the Ahmadi sect, which developed in the late 19th, earlier 20th century. And the founder of the Ahmadi movement claimed many things, like he was the awaited 12th Imam of the Shias, Imam Mahdi, that he was the awaited Messiah of the Jews and was Jesus Christ, as well as that he was Lord Krishna. Yes, all three he claimed. And he was able to win some people to his faith. So the Ahmadis were another group. All of them had jumped onto the Pakistani project. And now the problem was, okay, now we have a Pakistan. How do we define the rights of the citizens? Jinnah's 11th August speech is a negation of the whole idea of two nation, where he says Hindus will cease to be Hindus and Muslims will cease to be Muslims. Not in a religious sense, because that is a matter of private faith, but as citizens of the country. And people who were listening to him, even his immediate followers, couldn't believe it. Because here he was negating the campaign on which he had built the whole idea of Pakistan, that Hindus and Muslims can't live together. Now he was saying they can, and they will have equal rights. And some people wondered, was it then necessary to partition India, have 1 million, even more people killed, 14, 18 million people forced out of their homes, and the bitter controversies which it generated. But that was all lost in the background of this speech. Jinnah died a year later. So the next statement was then on the 7th of March 1948, which is the Objectives Resolution, which has a very peculiar wording. It says, sovereignty over the entire universe belongs to God Almighty, which he has delegated to the elected representatives of the people of Pakistan. Yeah, well, when this was presented, some people had this smile on their face, some giggled, some thought this was the most wonderful statement, because you could interpret it to your own interest. To the liberals, this was like a hoax. They were just trying to hoodwink the right wing, ulama type. But the ulama took it seriously. When you say that sovereignty belongs to God, and we all know to divide sovereignty is to destroy sovereignty. You can't have two sovereigns. So, the people of Pakistan, their elected representative, could not be direct bearers of sovereignty. They had delegated sovereignty. What it means, one can always discuss. Anyhow, to cut a very long story short, in 1956 we got a constitution which calls Pakistan the Islamic Republic. And it requires the president of Pakistan to be a Muslim. So it was initially only symbolic, except that they added that all laws will be brought into conformity with the Quran and Sunnah, which was like somehow in 1958, Ayub Khan overthrew the government. He introduced reforms. He changed the parliamentary system with the presidential system, claiming that in Islam a strong leader was important. And therefore the Khalifa tradition had to be revived. He introduced a top-down type of democracy, a basic democracies, where the people of Pakistan first elect 80,000 members of this college, and they in turn then elect the president of Pakistan. I think formally this is still the system in the US, although things have changed fundamentally there. But Ayub Khan seriously meant it, that people are only capable of electing their immediate representatives, who then hopefully should have education, popular support, and they would then be intelligent enough to choose the right president. Some people say that this was a good way of controlling who will elect you. So we find Ayub Khan presenting a quasi-democratic system. Reforms and all we can. Then we have, now the third, after the Tashkent declaration, as I said, Bhutto in West Pakistan and Mr. Mujib in East Pakistan started agitating for the revival of the parliamentary system and to Ayub Khan's rule. His unpopularity began by signing the Tashkent Declaration. That's the important thing to remember. The agitations continued, Ayub Khan abdicated, another general came to power, Yahya Khan. And the first elections, which were held in 1970, produced a result which the West Pakistani ruling elite was not willing to accept. What happened was that the Awami League in East Pakistan alone secured 191 seats in a house of 300. As a result, they had the right to form the government. And this was unacceptable to the army and to Mr. Bhutto, who got about 83 seats in 138 seats in West Pakistan. And there was a military intervention, and then the Indian army stepped in, and Pakistan was broken up. Now, from that breakup of power, the army also and the right wing right-wing people and the army said, look, we always said India was after the existence of Pakistan, and they have intervened and broken it up. So we have all the reason now to arm ourselves. I think we have to skip a lot. Like, for example, in 1974, India explodes the nuclear device, and in the broken Pakistan, Mr. Bhutto had come to power, and he said, we will eat grass, but we'll have our own atomic weapon. So Pakistan also started going in that direction. Bhutto ruled through popular mandate, but then rigged the elections and was overthrown by another general, Yahya Khan. General Yahya Khan finally brought to an end this whole discussion as to whether Pakistan is going to be a democracy or an Islamic state. And he said he has been given a mandate from God to bring Islam to Pakistan. So democracy, Ziaul Haq. So democracy can go to rest. And so he introduced what he called was Islamization reforms, which included a revival of a medieval code of punishments, apparently sanctioned in the Quran, and which was about 4 or 5 offenses described in the Quran, like thievery, highway robbery, adultery, fornication, and false accusation of adultery. These are the 5. So these were revived. And initially, some pedophiles or so were brought in the public and whipped. And then some black marketeers were also whipped. And Zia was hoping to create this aura of Islamic, honesty and so on. It didn't impress people a lot because everybody knew that the rich and the powerful and the corrupt, and they were all there, and none of them had been brought up and punished. He introduced much worse, which was the blasphemy law. The blasphemy law is probably even more dangerous than the hudud laws, because it says anybody who shows disrespect to Islam or the Prophet Muhammad can be charged for a serious offense. Initially, it was life imprisonment and a heavy penalty. Later on, it was both. It could be either life imprisonment or capital punishment. And finally, I think it was in 1991, the law says the maximum punishment or the punishment for blasphemy is capital punishment. And that has resulted in witch hunting of anybody you don't think is a good Muslim, and which could also be some colleague whose job you want but is a non-Muslim, and you say, well, he was abusing the Prophet. And then some people have gone up and killed these so-called blasphemers, and as far as I know, 1 or 2 were symbolically punished. Most of them got away with this murder. So Zia also attacked, the Afghan jihad then comes in. And so we are again back into the external nature of the Garrison state. Zia created the ideological basis for completing the Garrison state, which he called the fortress of Islam. The Afghan jihad meant that the Russians came into Afghanistan, and the old military pacts with America now came back to life. The Americans said, we are allies. We have been estranged for a while. Why? Because after the 65 war, the Pakistanis then turned to the Chinese to get arms. I should have mentioned that. So that was the second donor. But now, the Americans said, we have an agreement to fight against the spread of communism, and Zia was only too eager to respond. And the Chinese, by the way, also became part of this jihad. Ideologically, they brought in Saudi Arabia, and the reason why Saudi Arabia came in with a lot of interest was that only a year earlier, Ayatollah Khomeini had come to power in Iran, and Khomeini challenged the claims of the Saudis to be the leaders of the Muslim world. The Iranian revolution was actually the first successful model of political Islam. People very often forget it. Up until then, the Wahhabis used to fund the construction of mosques, but they were not so much into politics, except in the Middle East against Nasser. Now they started on a worldwide campaign to compete with the Iranians. The Iranians used their context in Pakistan to excite the Shia to rise up against the Sunni state. And like when Zia introduced the zakat reform, which is an obligatory tax, they refused to pay it, saying that it is a Sunni state and we pay tax only to the ulama in Qom in Iran. Which I think actually is the first time the Shia-Sunni problem comes up. Because had the Shias agreed to pay, maybe this would not have emerged. It was a provocation of the Pakistani Shias not to pay the zakat, saying that we pay it to the people in Qom, from where came a Sunni reaction. And the Sunnis then said, okay, well, you are agents of Iran and we are agents of the true Islam, and so there has been a proxy war between the Shia and Sunni in Pakistan for a long time. As you know, during the Afghan jihad, Pakistan got a lot of economic aid and military aid, and Pakistan was also able to develop its nuclear capability. I think relations with India. Well, after Mr. General Zia died in August 1988, there was a revival of democracy, elections, and so on. Benazir Bhutto came to power. She was thrown out on charges of corruption. Nawaz Sharif came to power and was thrown out. Then Benazir was again elected and thrown out. And then Nawaz Sharif was elected and thrown out. Finally, in October 1999, another general came into power, General Musharraf. Musharraf was more like the Ayub Khan type of modernizing ruler. We know that just before Musharraf's takeover, there had been an attempt between India and Pakistan to sort of improve their relations. First, they touched the nadir when both exploded their nuclear devices in May 1998. On both sides, there was jingoism to destroy the other. The Indians did it, and they thought that they are now powerful enough to get at Pakistan. 2 weeks later, Pakistan surprised, shocked the Indians by showing that they were equally good at hitting back. And so there was a new level of awareness in South Asia that it's not the old type of wars where you fight for 17 days and then run to the United Nations for a ceasefire. If another war breaks out, it could be a nuclear war. And so Mr. Vajpayee comes to Pakistan, and we have the Lahore Agreement of February 1999, only to be followed by the Kargil mini war initiated by General Musharraf. So once again, India-Pakistan relations were at the very worst. In October, he overthrew Sharif and came to power. While this Afghan jihad was taking place, there was a rethinking on the Pakistani military sort of assessment. And it was that because of all the arms that we now have at our disposal, we can create mujahideen who would go and liberate Kashmir. And so the Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Muhammad and many other India-Kashmir specific militant organizations were created. With regard to the Shia, the Sipai-Sahaba and later Lashkar-e-Jangvi were patronized to bring the Shias down to their size. And so terrorism continued. I think the turning point before we finish this is 9/11 and the beginning of the Taliban type terrorism, because this is when I call it the chickens come home to roost. On 9/11/2001, Al-Qaeda struck a number of targets in the United States, and the United States then said that either you are with us or against us, and they issued an ultimatum to Pakistan. Musharraf in his book says that he met his generals and they said we can only withstand American bombing for 6 days, and that will be all. So why not join the war on terror? And that is the only way we can retain our nuclear weapons intact. Otherwise, India will provide the Americans the bases, and Pakistan would be destroyed. So we joined this war on terror, and suddenly people who were described as mujahideen fighting in Afghanistan for jihad and so on now became terrorists because of the American redescription. And this was not easy to sell to the Pakistani audiences. So we find a number of terrorist acts taking place in Pakistan, 3 attempts only on the life of General Musharraf and his generals. And from 2003 onwards, you find terrorist attacks in Pakistan constantly on the increase, more and more directed against military installations and military personnel, but also against Shias, Ahmadis, Christians, and Hindus. Musharraf fell from power in 2008 when the lawyers rose against him. Now we have, in 2008 elections were held, a PPP-led alliance came into power. I don't have to go into what has happened since then, because 26th November 2008 is another instance where Pakistan and India could have gone to war. A superpower, Islamic superpower, had come to naught. Liberating Kashmir had also ended in a failure. And on top of it, now these people who had been trained to kill in the name of whatever were now turning their guns onto the Pakistani state. And I have given all the, well, all I don't, I mean, the main actions taken during this period. About 40,000 Pakistanis have been killed by Taliban and Taliban type terrorist organizations. I think we can end on this by saying that the worst indication that the Pakistani garrison state, post-colonial garrison state, is in no position to control its own societal is the situation is that on the 4th of January 2001, the governor of Punjab, Salman Taseer, was brutally killed by his own bodyguard. All he had said was that the woman, a Christian woman accused of blasphemy, saying that the law seems to be unsafe and we have to reconsider it. That was enough for them to accuse him of blasphemy, and they killed him. And you wouldn't believe it, but when Salman Taseer was killed, many of his colleagues in the ministry didn't join in the funeral prayers. Few did. So you can imagine the amount of terrorized people in Pakistan, including those in power. This was followed by a hero of this Afghan jihad, Colonel Imam, being executed on the 24th of January by the Taliban, saying that he was an American agent. Then Federal Minister for Minority Affairs, a Catholic, Shahbaz Bhatti, was killed on the 2nd of March. All this was going on within Pakistan, and the final, I think, exposure of the hollowness of this post-colonial garrison state was the fact that the Americans proved that they were still the main donors and the main power within the Pakistani state project when they sent their own Navy SEALs all the way into Abbottabad. They go, they identify Osama bin Laden, kill him, and the generals who up until then have been claiming to be the saviors of Pakistan have no argument now left. Because how can you ever explain away that a foreign power comes and can, conduct a military operation and for 45 minutes, 1 hour or whatever and get away with it without you being aware of it. Now there are two theories. One is that this could not have been possible without people at the top giving a nod. And we can't discount that. Another idea is that this was done at a lower level, which is the official position. But this was done with the help of people in Pakistan. So the post-colonial state today is an economic disaster, and militarily, as I have shown, the line of control is still there. Pakistan has not been able to liberate Kashmir. On the contrary, Pakistan's own civil society, civil peace is in tatters. So Pakistan is in a very bad shape. I'll end here by some suggestions. I think the threat from India will remain as long as both sides indulge in zero-sum games, while ritualistically speaking of peace and reconciliation. Pakistan will have to maintain a strong military to ward off threats, but both threats seem to come from within Pakistan. Dependence on foreign donors for arming Pakistan cannot be taken for granted. The Americans are no longer going to arm Pakistan, we know it. They are there just if they can get hold of the Taliban leadership and Al-Qaeda in North Waziristan. The Chinese would always help Pakistan to keep a handle on India. But if India and China become cozy through trade and all, I'm sure China would also reconsider its relationship with Pakistan. One reason being that its northwest province has an Islamic insurgency going on, and they can't go along with Pakistan too much. Saudi Arabia is already in a poor state. Terrorism has struck them as well. So their ability to arm and promote extremism is severely curtailed. And one reason is that one of your terrorists was handed over to India by the Saudis. Now that's something which is interesting to keep in mind. So I think all three patterns from whose help Pakistan became this garrison state cannot bail out Pakistan in the future. Pakistan's national interest is to agree to the line of control being declared as the international border on the east, and I have suggested that Pakistan should insist that the Durand line should be accepted by the international community as the international border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. If that were to happen, we can all live happily in peace and so on. Thank you very much. I took an hour, a little longer, Hannah.
First question is about you're writing this book. It's like, I want to know, did you face any challenge, any problem from this Pakistani side or Pakistani military side about your writings? And
okay.
Second thing is about this Raja Hari Singh's this
accession bill.
Accession, as you told that it was temporary.
Yeah.
It was not permanent, and it is said that it will be reconsidered. So what happened
Subsequently?
After that?
Okay.
And
two are enough so that others also have.
Thank you, sir.
The first question is like, did I face any? The book is based on extensive interviews with retired military officers, including 3 heads of the ISI, including 3 chiefs of army staff, which is the highest officer, many brigadiers, lieutenant generals, major generals, and so on and so forth. Pakistan is a very interesting country, in the sense that If you go and talk to people, they will open their heart and tell you everything. And I would imagine they thought that being a Pakistani origin myself, they could tell me whatever they thought was important. And so I don't think I've taken advantage of that, because I made it a point to tell them that my analysis will be an independent one. And they are welcome to give me an interview only if they accept that the final word is mine. And so they agreed. So there is nothing here which I have not clarified for them. And I received an email from the Chief of Army Staff, General Jahangir Karamat, who preceded Musharraf, he was his senior, saying that this is an amazingly good book, and he congratulated me. He wrote it a week after the book was available in Lahore. So I'm hoping he read it. Yeah, but I think it must be so. Why? Because he wouldn't write this down if he didn't believe that this was something he could, stand by. So the book is written in a way which is very critical of the military, but it ends up on a note trying to show that if you do the right things, you still have a good chance of being a normal state. So it's not meant to be a destructive exercise. It's meant to be a very unrelenting exposure of all the failures, but also trying to show the way how this can be done. That India and Pakistan can be excellent partners if they only seize the historical opportunity. And I think this would makes sense to many. About your second, India claims that in 1954, after elections in Kashmir, the Kashmir Assembly voted for permanent accession to India. The Pakistani position is that this Kashmir Assembly did not include representatives from people in the Pakistani Kashmir. So it's not representative enough. It's partial. So they dispute it, but the Indian position is that accession bill is no longer temporary, it's permanent. Yeah.
You're given a very interesting talk, but it leaves one question unanswered.
Does it?
That in 47, when India was partitioned by that Radcliffe Award and Jinnah's insistence and all that, we were similar people with similar economic background and caste system and so many internal dissensions. Over a period of 65 years, now there is a glaring disparity between the two countries.
Sir, well,
that we agree. Is it only economic disparity, or the reasons are more about the leadership and the stability in the one region and instability in the other region? We've had 7 prime ministers in 65 years, and they have had 10 prime ministers in 7 years for 7 years.
Okay.
So what are that is the thing which would answer a little more, that how come in 65 years there is so much economic disparity and trouble in the two, this thing?
Well, I don't know what you have in mind with regard to economic disparity. What Pakistan, until about the 1990s at least, had a higher standard of living than than India.
No,
people are better fed even now.
The forecast for the economic the future in India is much more, that in the next 10 years on PPP basis, it will be number 2 or number 3 in the world, and the other country doesn't feature anywhere near that.
That's true, but that is from sometimes, I think, after 9/11. Even during the time of Musharraf, the rate of growth of the economy was quite impressive. 7%, 8%. Pakistan in the 60s was considered a model country of economic growth. Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, and South Korea sent their people to study the Pakistani project. It was celebrated by the World Bank as a model country, until Mr. Bhutto and company took us to war in Kashmir. So Pakistan's economic downturn is from 1965 onwards. And conflict with India is the main reason why Pakistan's economy doesn't perform well, because if they provoke conflict with India, they have to spend a lot on maintaining a strong military and army and so on. So it's like a vicious circle. You keep on investing more and more on defense, but you can't keep pace with India. India outpaces. Like in the book I mentioned, India spent $34 billion in 2011 on buying arms. Pakistan spent only 5 billion. So by comparison, it's still a smaller amount. But we still can't compete with India, because India's economy is 5 times bigger, and you are able to diversify much more successfully. Of course, the Indian argument is that they are arming themselves in relation to the Chinese threat. So it's a triangle. India argues it is China, Pakistan argues it is India. The three constitute a triangle. And so the rest I've already mentioned, that Pakistan didn't have a political vision worked out for itself. It came into being at the very last moment. The British, on the 12th of May 1947, wrote this memorandum, which was then sent to 10 Downing Street, and then they decided on the 3rd of June 1947 to announce the partition of India. So up until then, there was no idea that Pakistan will come into being. So Pakistan came into being at the very last moment, without a vision, without a structure of government which could take over, without a political party prepared to do it. And that is why I call it a post-colonial state, unable to function like a normal state.
Cyril Radcliffe, just an interesting history. Cyril Radcliffe, who gave that award, he himself was not convinced about Jinnah's demand, and he was sitting on a map and for 10-15 days trying to, on a religious majority basis, and he decided by giving his award that he will leave India or leave Pakistan on 14th of August, because he knew he will be the target. That why have you given this to him and given that to him and all that? And he left India. And then in his last words, when he died in Britain, he said, what did I do?
Well, what did I do? There are many people who say, yeah. Actually, but also I go through it. The Radcliffe Award is actually based on what Viceroy Wavell had demarcated on the 7th of February 1946. It is a ditto demarcation. So basically, the Pakistanis should be condemning Wavell rather than Mountbatten. Mountbatten's interference could be of some nominal character, but the basic plan is the same as the Wavell plan.
After independence, they had a common commander-in-chief for, I think,
few weeks, Auchinleck. And then he had to leave because both sides wouldn't have him. Haji.
I wanted to ask two questions.
Yes.
One is about the idea of this post-colonial and neo-colonial state. Basically, there seems to be a view, as far as the Western powers are concerned, that the old neo-colonial model is no longer valid. In fact, now they feel that by encouraging internal dissension and having a lot of small wars being fought, they're quite comfortable with it. Whereas earlier, you wanted a kind of a puppet ruler or whatever it is that could give you some stability. So the fear of instability seems to have gone. And so the idea is that let's keep them, I don't, your view on this. I've heard this, I'm not a political scientist, but the second one is actually about the lack of any real insight on economics in your entire talk, because I also read about this thing about Pakistan doing quite well, in fact, before 1990. So therefore, why doesn't it leave any residue in the political economy of Pakistan, And is there a kind of a linkage, which you haven't mentioned, between the army and the economy? I mean, they must be investing, there must be things which, etc. So is that a factor which is giving a particular solidarity to the present political economy?
Well, I thought some things I could take for granted that you are familiar with, because this has been in the news, that the Pakistan military is a major holder of property in terms of banks, real estate, agricultural production, and insurance companies. So I didn't go into this, but it's in the book, all is there. And a scholar has already done it. So I have just quoted her, and nobody has challenged it. It's Aisha Siddiqa. So I don't want to claim to have contributed something which is very ably done by another colleague. And it's in the book. But in this presentation, given the limit of the time, I chose those things which I think I have brought in, which others haven't.
What is the significance of the economic front? You see, there seems to be a silence on the economic front.
Well, the significance is
it all security?
No, but the Pakistan military was doing very well, and the Pakistani economy, until terrorism started striking within Pakistan. So it's after Musharraf joined the the Bush war on terror, that the Pakistan economy has gone bad to an extent that now we are nowhere around India. Otherwise, the rate of growth of Pakistan, even under Ziaul Haq, was well comparable to India, in fact better. Pakistan's standard of living till recently, and some would say even now, is better than that of India, if we look at how people live generally. Yeah? But my feeling is that this is not true anymore. The number of people unemployed and recruited by the extremists come from very poor families. So Pakistan's economy has been destroyed by what I was trying to tell you about the jihad and how this has, undermined the whole project from within. I think this is clear from what I present about the Pakistani situation. Your main question, if the US or the West are now promoting internal conflicts, I don't know. All I know is that on 3-4 occasions, the Americans have actually helped prevent war between India and Pakistan. One is Kargil. The second is 2001-2002, when the attack on the Indian Parliament took place. And third, when LDT carried out its terrorist actions in Mumbai. So there, American diplomacy has been extremely helpful in defusing conflict. But indeed, they could be involved here and there.
There were two questions from that side of the room. I'll come back to you.
It was nice to see you. I think that during my period of 7 months in university, it's the first time I am finding a Pakistani speaker, although we are from Stockholm, talking, and that's a good beginning, I suppose, that Indo-Pakistan relation can be in a better spirit. That can start from you, Professor. My questions are of 3 different time zones. I may say that it is a past, present, and future. My first question is going like this. What steps in Pakistan were taken to get rid of madrasas being branded as seat of terrorism? It's a big thing, and you have also shown in this one of the PowerPoint screens. My second one is, what Pakistan is doing to protect Shias and other minorities from regular brutal killing. Yesterday, day before yesterday, almost every day, Quetta and different places. And the third is the future. Do you see any hope of normalization between Pakistan and India through strong trade relations?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for your kind words. Well, let me say like this, that the madrasas are still very much there. Let me now, this is good you took it up. We tend to believe that it's only the madrasas which are producing this extremist mindset. But some of us, Pakistani scholars, have shown that the mainstream textbooks already create a lot of poison. It's rabidly anti-India, it's rabidly anti-Hindu. So it's not just the madrasas. The madrasas get the blame because they are so visible. But the whole educational system is geared to this reproduction of an anti-Indiaism as part of the state project. Okay? The madrasas now are, in 1974 there were only 400 madrasas. And these madrasas have existed since there has been Islam. And their role has been to train people as scholars of Islam at the higher and lower levels. So this has been part of the normal duty of all states. When the Afghan jihad started, Saudi money and then other extremist money poured in from the Middle East and so on. And 20,000 madrasas came into being. Altogether, 1.7 million pupils were produced in a period of 10 years. What type of books were used there? Well, the Americans, as I said, were the main promoters of this jihad, along with the Saudis. And the University of Nebraska was given $50 million to produce textbooks to be taught in the schools in Afghanistan and in the tribal areas. And this was one of a page out of the textbook, which if you want, you can have a look at. This is how it teaches young pupils to learn how to count. A group of 24 mujahid attacked the Russians. As a result, each mujahid killed 12 Russians. Find out how many aggressive Russians were eliminated. 24 into 12 is 188. So this is thanks the courtesy of the CIA, the Saudis, and of course the Pakistani involvement in it. Those madrasas are still around. There is a big discussion to close them down. There have been half-hearted attempts to do that. But you know, the Taliban are able to attack anywhere in Pakistan. In Lahore they can do it, in Karachi they are doing it all the time. Nobody has the guts really to evolve a policy to eliminate them. So the policy against the Shia elimination will also go when the state decides that this is the last thing. Yesterday I think they decided to send the army into Balochistan, and if this becomes a pattern for the whole country, then there is a chance. Your third question is, if trade is the way out. Of course, this is what I say. Okay.
Do we have time? Do we have time?
Sure.
Is the role or the state of the civil society in Pakistan now? I mean, I find it hard to believe that they are this voiceless, marginalized lot.
Sorry, say?
I find it hard to believe that the civil society is this voiceless lot.
not at
I mean,
all.
do you see any hopes for a popular movement or a revolution coming up in the future?
Well, let me say that, in my opinion, the Pakistani mass media, especially the print media, English language publications, are far more critical of what happens in Pakistan than I think the Indian media is. And that's thanks to Musharraf, President Musharraf, a military man who said, let them write whatever they want. So we write all the, what I'm saying here is part of my weekly column on Tuesdays. And I'm not the only one. And I live in Stockholm, so I am beyond their reach. There are people who live in Pakistan and write highly critical articles. The only question is how many people read the English language thing. That I can't say much about. But the educated people do. And they are liberal and they mostly believe in peace with India. But the Urdu language media is dominated by right-wing type of people. So there are two messages being sent in Pakistan all the time. You meet people like me who can speak a bit of English and they'll say we want peace with India. You meet somebody who's more in the regular Urdu speaking, they might have different views on it. Okay? But one can't say that the civil society is quiet at all. It's always there when there are attacks on the Ahmadis or Hindus or whosoever. They demonstrate and they take great risks to agitate against such things. So there is a civil society which is very active, but how influential it is, one can just wonder. What I'm saying is that at present the state seems to be totally paralyzed in doing even the needful to establish law and order within the parameters of the state. And that's a very disturbing situation.
Ishtiaq, are you saying that had Pakistan not joined the war that Bush wanted them to join, this sort of violence would not have happened in the country? And you've got your first democratic transition this year. To what extent is that significant?
I would say that the reason terrorism expanded beyond what was going on at that time, which is attacks on Shias and occasionally the Christians, into attacks on the Pakistani military installments, the headquarters of the Pakistan military, attacks on Musharraf and his generals. This emerged only after we joined the war on terror. So it's an expansion of terrorism, which is now terrorism directed against the Pakistani state. Previously, the terrorism was more directed against the Shia minority or the Christians and occasionally the Hindus. The second question was?
You got your first democratic transition this year, right?
Yeah.
To what extent will that help resolve it in the way that you want it resolved?
Well, you know, the understanding now emerging in Pakistan is that even a corrupt type of civilian rule is preferable, and if you go through the democratic ritual, it confers greater respectability to how power becomes legitimate. If you keep on disrupting it, then democracy is a weak starter. If we have a second election, it will establish a precedent as how to do it. So if we have another round of elections, one would imagine in the wisdom of political science, this is good.
I can see that we have at least 3 questions, so let us have all the 3 questions together. Yes, sure. Two people here.
Ishtiaq, the period that you were referring to in the 1960s, when Pakistan had a respectable growth rate, and the Indian economic growth rate was called the Hindu rate of growth. It's curious then, isn't it, that for all the early history of capital infusions and capitalism and just enterprise in Pakistan as compared to here, that capital couldn't control or safeguard the peace that it required to perpetuate itself towards the end of the late 1990s and in the first parts of the 21st century in ways in which, let's say, India's economy and capacity to go to war would be accused of as being somewhat slightly more controlled by capital, meaning, which is to say that, given the heavy investments several countries have here, they have a material stake in preventing anything that destroys it. So I was wondering if you could say something about that.
Well, I think till the 60s, my understanding is that foreign investments in India were very few. Maybe some Russian investment or none. So none. So then that doesn't apply to India. Doesn't apply to India at that time. But to Pakistan, the investment came via the World Bank, IMF, and the Americans. What does it mean? I mean, this question is a bit difficult to grasp. How does capital control politics? What do you have in mind? Well, that's only if one is assuming that politics is simply a derivative of the economic, calculation. Unfortunately, that is not the case. And Pakistan was doing very well economically. They had an inflated ideas that they even liberate Kashmir now, we would do even better. So capital controlling Pakistan's rationality didn't apply. Okay?
My question is about actually the local imaginations of a state in Pakistan in the eyes of subalterns, let's say. So in case of India, from the 1950s onwards, there was this narrative of India as a developmentalist state.
Sorry?
India as a developmentalist state. Right, so planned economy and a certain kind of developmental paradigm that you needed to focus.
Yeah.
And it seems that in last 60 years, there has been a downward shift in the commitment of people and the bourgeoisie towards that kind of developmentalist state. So much so that today in India it's very difficult not to find the remotest of the subaltern committed to the idea of development and making calls on the state to deliver that. Right? How has that panned out in case of Pakistan? How is a normal subaltern looking at Pakistani state to make demands about its everyday requirements?
Okay, I get the point. Well, Pakistan also had its 5 years plans, you know. Only the plans were very clear that investment would be made by the state, and once the units were becoming profitable, they would be sold to private hands. So the state created the national bourgeoisie. And this was going on pretty well, actually, until the Kashmir war started. And subsequently, as well, it's been more like a free-for-all type of economic situation. And the amount of planning which goes into the Nehruvian state project and which still is not over, I think. It's still very much the state is central to, in terms of the subaltern claims. Like I heard 100 days of employment is offered by the state and all. Nothing of the sort has happened in Pakistan. Even when we had our 5 years plan, the thing was that private initiative, economic growth would generate jobs. And so the people have been, the agrarian economy has done well during the Green Revolution thing. So it was also something managed by the people on their own, by the farmer and so on. State intervention came only for a short while during the time of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. He introduced quite ambitious reforms for the working class and carried out land reforms. But then came Zia and he undid all that. So people have not had the state as its, shall we say, my baap, protector, except that jihad and all have captured the imagination, and people, well, large numbers, they go and join these organizations, or most of the remittances, the main source of Pakistan's foreign exchange are remittances of overseas Pakistanis. When the Americans are not bailing us out, we still have a very large amount of money coming in from the remittances. I think the percentage of Pakistanis who work abroad in relation to India is much higher. So that explains how families can still manage. But there is a desperation at the very lower level where people have no support. Some manage to send their children to the madrasas where they get food and all, but small number. So it's a desperate situation now. It wasn't there earlier. Okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
From all your narratives so far, could you please, bring some nuances of recent mobilization by Tahir al-Qadiri of MQI? Personally, I was following, the developments by MQI, and I found it interesting that one of his fatwas against jihad is very much, as I understand, do justice to the jurisprudential sources of Islam. And also, I know some of the well-known politicians, Muslim politicians, who take anti-extremist views in my home state in Kerala. India, his fatwas against jihad and all that.
Okay. Well, he come and where did he go? He appeared suddenly and has disappeared with equal
this is in
drama.
this is a question in addition to the on civil society.
Yeah. I would say like this, that the general understanding is that once the Americans move out, what to do with this region? And jihad and so on doesn't suit the government in Afghanistan, Karzai. Does it suit the Pakistani state anymore? There are some doubts. So Qadri, who was on the political horizon of Pakistan for a short while, had a political party also. 6 years earlier, he emigrated to Canada, suddenly came back. And as you say, he has issued a fatwa saying that terrorism is against Islam. And in 2012, I think he visited India and was given quite a reception in many parts of India. Why? Because he spoke on similar lines as I am doing trade, friendship, so on. So he is considered a man maybe one can borrow ideas from if the opportunity arrives. He came to Pakistan and was hoping to bring down the government, and they want an election to be held in which all the black marketeers, corrupt politicians, bad people and so on have been eliminated. And so they say that if there are good people in power, then true democracy will come. Whether this was genuinely the case or it was an argument to bring the military back into power, we don't know. What we know is that the bluff was called rather easily by the politicians. They signed some agreement with him, and as a face-saving thing, he went back. So how much of Qadri really is now part of the Pakistani political scene, I don't know. It seems to have been a very temporary aberration sort of thing, happened and disappeared. What I would say is that the establishment, the Pakistan military and so on, until last year in the spring were relying on Imran Khan. Yes, because Imran Khan had also been saying anti-corruption, anti-this, anti-that. But then within his party there have been many people have left him. There is criticism that he's a one-man show and he doesn't share his power with his own party people. And so maybe he's not that great a winner as he seemed to be last year in spring. And maybe they thought Qadri might do the trick. Qadri also proved to be a failure. So the situation in Pakistan is like Akar was saying, if there is a regular election, that seems to be what everybody spinning hopes would create the basis of some sort of consolidation of democracy.
Sir,
Okay.
Sir, I want to know more something about the U.S. foreign policy over Pakistan. And the question is that recently I came across one article in Hindu opinion page saying that the earlier Pakistan's increasing warhead is for the motive to fight against India.
Okay.
Earlier, it was assumed like that. So recently, this increasing warhead has the motive of the increasing warhead has been shifted from India to US. So even when there is some great, Pakistan is considered to be the greatest ally of US in Asia.
Or used to be.
Yeah. So how does and again how Pakistan is getting a lot of aid even when there is less contribution in the war against terrorism. US also know this. And what is this kind of foreign policy? I don't know.
Okay. What missile capability can reach Indian targets, and they don't have that capability to reach US targets. So this seems to be speculation, I think. I have not heard of Pakistan developing intercontinental ballistic missile capability. If they are, then the Americans would be very worried. So I don't know. As far as I know is, Pakistan's fixation is still India. That if you hit us, we hit you, that sort of thing.
Well, thank you so much. I won't take more than a minute. I have no questions to ask you at all, but I have two demands to make.
Sure.
One, that you come more often,
Okay.
right? And two, that you send more Pakistanis to our university, as many as you can, because you can see that lots of people want dialogue.
Absolutely.
They want
Absolutely.
discussion. They have questions to ask. We are already at about 5:50, and I know that professors here have withheld their questions so that students can ask them. Vikas, for example, always has a fund of questions, and he'll probably enter into a long dialogue with you after this. So thank you very much indeed, and we are very grateful that you made the time and that you've initiated this dialogue about Pakistan. Although we are in the south, yet I can tell you that we offer courses about Pakistan here, courses which have topics of discussion regarding both the creation of Pakistan and contemporary Pakistan politics and the economy and so on and so forth. So there is a great interest in Pakistan and in South Asia more generally in our university. Thanks.
Thank you very much.